This iceberg catalogs belief systems by familiarity and obscurity. Placement is not a judgment of truth or legitimacy. Some entries involve disturbing or extremist material. Viewer discretion is advised. Timestamps are provided below. This entry, Creativity, refers to a movement founded in 1973 by Ben Klassen, a former Florida state legislator and self-published author. The organization originally called itself the World Church of the Creator, though it later shortened the name to simply the Creativity Movement after legal challenges over trademark disputes. Klassen developed what he termed a racial religion, built around a text he wrote called Nature's Eternal Religion. The core philosophy centers on what adherents call racial holy war, and promotes the survival and advancement of what they define as the white race above all other considerations. Members refer to themselves as creators, and the belief system explicitly rejects all traditional theistic religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, viewing them as harmful to their stated goals. The movement gained attention in the 1990s under the leadership of Matthew Hale, who rebranded himself as Pontifex Maximus, and attempted to legitimize the organization through legal channels and media appearances. Hale's tenure ended when he was convicted in 2005 for soliciting the murder of a federal judge who had ruled against the organization in a trademark case. He received a 40-year prison sentence. Creativity uses its own calendar system, counting years from what they claim is the beginning of the white race. They celebrate racial purity through ceremonies they call confirmations, and practice dietary guidelines they believe optimize racial characteristics. The movement publishes literature and maintains a presence online, though its membership numbers remain relatively small and fragmented across different factions. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries classify the Creativity movement as a hate group. Several individuals claiming affiliation have been convicted of violent crimes, including Benjamin Smith's 1999 shooting spree in Illinois and Indiana that left 2 dead and 9 wounded. This entry, Eastern Lightning, also known as the Church of Almighty God, centers on a belief that Jesus Christ returned to Earth in 1991 as a Chinese woman. The movement emerged from underground Christian house churches in Henan Province, China, founded by a former physics teacher named Zhao Weishan. The central figure, however, is Yang Xiangbin, a woman Zhao proclaimed to be the incarnation of God Almighty. Members believe her writings, compiled into a book called The Word Appears in the Flesh, contain divine revelations that supersede the Bible. Yang's teachings claim she represents the third and final age of God's work on earth. The first age belonged to Jehovah in the Old Testament, the second to Jesus in the New Testament, and the third age belongs to Almighty God, manifested through Yang herself. Her writings allegedly expose the corruption of traditional Christianity and reveal the path to salvation before an imminent apocalypse. The group became infamous for its aggressive recruitment methods. Members allegedly targeted other Christian congregations, sometimes using deception to gain access to churches and convert members. Reports emerged of recruiters using romantic relationships, job offers, and even financial incentives to draw people in. Some former members described being held against their will during indoctrination sessions. In 2014, the movement gained international attention after a brutal incident at a McDonald's restaurant in Shandong Province. 6 Eastern Lightning members beat a woman to death after she refused to provide her phone number for recruitment purposes. The attackers claimed she was a demon. 5 members received death sentences or life imprisonment. The Chinese government designated Eastern Lightning as a dangerous cult and launched extensive crackdowns. Thousands of members were arrested, and the leadership fled the country. Zhao Weishan and Yang Xiangbin relocated to the United States, where they established a headquarters in New York. The organization claims over 4 million followers worldwide, though independent verification remains difficult. The movement operates with military-level organization. Members use code names, encrypted communications, and counter-surveillance techniques. They produce professional propaganda materials, including films, books, and social media content, translated into dozens of languages. Their recruitment has expanded into South Korea, Taiwan, the United States, and various Southeast Asian countries. Former members describe a hierarchical structure where questioning the teachings leads to severe punishment. Families are often separated, with members required to abandon their homes and live in safe houses with other believers. The organization collects significant financial contributions from members, though the exact amounts and their use remain undisclosed.
Like this video and subscribe to Maker.
This entry, The Church of Jesus Christ of the Whole Universe, started when a disgraced Croatian priest decided the Catholic Church's problem was thinking too small. Founded officially in 2018 by Tomislav Vlasic and his partner Stefania Katarina, the group teaches that Earth is just one tiny corner of God's cosmic real estate. Vlasic's story reads like a soap opera written by a theologian. He was one of the original 4 priests working with the famous Medjugorje visionaries in 1981, when 6 teenagers in Bosnia claimed the Virgin Mary was appearing to them. During this time, letters surfaced revealing Vlasic had an affair with a nun and fathered a child. These letters ended up in the hands of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI. By 1987, Vlasic left Medjugorje, officially to start a new community in Italy, but also because everyone knew about the scandal. In 1994, he met Stefania Katarina, who joined his group and claims to be a seer herself. The two retreated into isolation in 2007, where they say archangels and apostles gave them direct revelations about God's master plan. They published these revelations in 2008 in a book called Beyond the Great Barrier. The core teaching splits existence into 3 separate universes: the high universe, middle universe, and low universe. Each one contains humans created in God's image. According to their doctrine, God didn't just create Adam and Eve. He created many couples who formed small nations across multiple universes. When Lucifer rebelled, God showed these couples the choice between serving him or the devil, and different groups answered differently. The group believes Jesus came to Earth specifically because this is where humanity needs the most help, but his mission extends far beyond our planet. They teach that countless humans exist throughout the universe who don't know about Jesus yet, and Earth's church has a responsibility to eventually reach them. Their theology hinges on something they call the central nucleus. Vlasic and Katarina claim they're part of a group of exactly 50 people chosen by God to save humanity across all universes. After the Great Jubilee in 2000, they say God accelerated his timeline for a new creation and asked the official Catholic Church to recognize the existence of extraterrestrial humans. When the Vatican refused, God supposedly activated 3 extraordinary instruments in 2004: the central nucleus, the angels, and what they call the brothers faithful to God in the universe. The Catholic Church did not take kindly to any of this. Between 2008 and 2009, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, essentially the Vatican's theology police, slapped Vlasic with restrictions and prohibitions. He was dismissed from the community he founded and left the Franciscan order entirely. The Church stripped him of his ability to function as a priest within Catholicism. None of this stopped him. On May 20th, 2018, Vlasic and Katarina formally established their Church of Jesus Christ of the Whole Universe. They registered it as a non-profit organization in Italy the following year. Their stated goal, printed plainly on their official website, is to save the whole universe. They operate several house sanctuaries, which function as prayer centers and meeting locations. These exist in Medjugorje itself, despite Vlasic's complicated history there, plus locations in Gaudiya and Finale Liger in Italy, and somewhere in the Czech Republic. Followers can visit these sanctuaries to learn about the church's programs and receive what they call spiritual formation. The group positions itself as a continuation of Mary's plan at Medjugorje. They claim that if the Catholic Church had simply recognized those apparitions and followed Mary's teachings, a powerful, unified church spanning the entire universe would have emerged quickly. Since that didn't happen, they present themselves as Plan B, the faithful remnant who will accomplish God's cosmic goals without official church approval. Messages from Mary published on their website express disappointment that the Church of the Earth failed to recognize the truth. These channeled communications describe a new people on Earth, who believe in universal brothers and sisters and want to unite with them. The tone suggests insider knowledge and special divine favor, classic markers of groups that see themselves as spiritually elite. Their theology blends Catholic imagery with science fiction concepts: interplanetary humans, multiple universes, direct angelic contact, and a countdown to new creation. It takes the Medjugorje phenomenon, already controversial within Catholicism, and launches it into literal outer space. For a church founded by a man who lost his priesthood over personal scandals and unauthorized revelations, they've built an impressively elaborate cosmology where they're central to God's universal redemption plan. Laestadianism covers a Lutheran revival movement that took root in northern Scandinavia during the 1840s and quietly grew into one of the most demanding Christian denominations still practicing today. Lars Levi Laestadius, a Swedish Sami preacher working in the isolated mining towns of Lapland, sparked this movement after witnessing the devastating effects of alcoholism on indigenous Sami communities. His solution became a form of Christianity so strict that it makes most evangelical denominations look permissive by comparison. The movement's stance on birth control puts them in a category almost entirely their own among Protestant groups. Laestadianism forbids all forms of contraception, viewing each act of intimacy as a direct invitation for God to create life. The practical result shows up in their communities immediately. Families with 8, 10, or 12 children remain common, with some households reaching 15 or more. In regions of northern Minnesota and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where Laestadian communities established themselves among Finnish immigrants, you can still find entire church congregations where the average family has 9 children. The technology restrictions extend beyond what most conservative Christians practice. Televisions were banned until recently in the strictest congregations. Musical instruments in worship remain forbidden. Dancing, even at weddings, breaks the rules. The internet presents an ongoing debate within different Laestadian factions, with the most conservative groups treating smartphones like portals to corruption. Their practice of absolution separates them from mainstream Lutheranism in a fundamental way. Any baptized Laestadian can absolve another person's sins, a power that traditional Christianity reserves exclusively for ordained clergy or, in Protestant theology, for God alone through personal faith. This creates a system where public confession happens regularly, and ordinary community members pronounce forgiveness over each other. Critics point out how this gives tremendous social power to lay people within these tight-knit groups. The movement split into multiple factions over the decades, each claiming to preserve Laestadius's true teachings. The Old Apostolic Lutherans, the FirstBorn Laestadians, and the Conservative Laestadians maintain distinct identities, with the level of strictness varying between them. The Old Apostolic Lutheran Church, the largest faction in North America, runs its own construction companies and logging operations, creating insular economic systems where members work almost exclusively with each other. Education in Laestadian communities stops at practical necessity for many families. While they don't explicitly forbid higher education the way some groups do, the culture strongly discourages it. Young adults pursuing university degrees often face subtle and not so subtle pressure about worldly corruption and pride. The result leaves many communities with limited professional diversity, though their skilled trades workers and construction crews built a strong reputation. Former members describe the psychological weight of the community's boundaries. Leaving means losing your entire social network, often including immediate family members who cut contact with those who abandon the faith. The term unbeliever gets applied to anyone outside the movement, including other Christians, creating a sharp division between Laestadians and everyone else. The movement thrives in areas where geographic isolation reinforces social isolation. In northern Finland, Norway, and Sweden, entire villages remain predominantly Laestadian. The same pattern appears in rural Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington state, where their communities cluster in areas far from major cities. This entry, Pent I, refers to the Ethiopian Evangelical movement that emerged as one of the most persecuted yet fastest-growing religious groups in East Africa. The name comes from the Amharic pronunciation of Pentecostal, though the movement encompasses various Protestant evangelical denominations beyond just Pentecostalism. Starting in the early 20th century, missionaries from Sweden and other Western nations introduced evangelical Christianity to Ethiopia, a country that had practiced Orthodox Christianity since the 4th century. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church viewed these newcomers as heretics attempting to corrupt the ancient faith. The government shared this hostility. Between 1975 and 1991, during the communist Derg regime, Pent I believers faced systematic persecution that included imprisonment, torture, and execution. Church buildings were destroyed, pastors were arrested, and congregations were forced to meet in homes, forests, and caves to avoid detection. What made Pent I particularly threatening to authorities was its emphasis on personal conversion over inherited tradition. Unlike Orthodox Christianity, which most Ethiopians were born into, Pntei required individuals to make a conscious decision to accept Christianity. This created tight-knit communities of believers who saw themselves as spiritually reborn, separate from the cultural Christianity around them. During the height of persecution, believers developed elaborate systems to continue worship. They held services in the middle of the night, posted lookouts to watch for police, and used code words to communicate meeting times and locations. Bibles were copied by hand when printed versions became too dangerous to possess. Despite, or perhaps because of this persecution, the movement exploded in size. By 2007, Pntei believers made up roughly 19% of Ethiopia's population, a remarkable growth from less than 1% in the 1970s. The movement proved especially popular in southern Ethiopia and among urban youth who felt disconnected from Orthodox traditions. Today, Pntei churches in Ethiopia feature energetic worship services with contemporary music, speaking in tongues, faith healing, and marathon prayer sessions that can last through the night. The movement has also spread to the Ethiopian diaspora, establishing churches in cities across North America and Europe. The Assyrian Evangelical Church is one of the most quietly fascinating survival stories in the entire history of Christianity, and it tends to get overlooked simply because most people have never heard of it. To understand why it matters, you need a bit of context. The Assyrian people are the direct ethnic descendants of the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations of Assyria and Babylon. They are one of the oldest continuous ethnic groups on Earth, and they have been Christian since roughly the 1st century. These are not converts who adopted Christianity when it became fashionable across the Roman Empire. They were among the earliest communities to receive it, speaking Aramaic, which is the language Jesus himself would have spoken day to day. The Assyrian Evangelical Church specifically emerged in the mid-1800s, largely through the influence of American Presbyterian and Congregationalist missionaries who came to the region around what is now northwestern Iran and southeastern Turkey. What makes this unusual is that these missionaries were not converting pagans. They were approaching people who had been Christian for nearly 2,000 years, and encouraging them to strip away centuries of liturgical tradition in favor of a more scripture-focused, reformed style of worship. This created genuine theological tension within Assyrian communities, dividing families between those who held to the ancient Assyrian Church of the East or the Chaldean Catholic Church, and those who embraced the evangelical model. Then came the catastrophe. During and after World War I, Assyrian Christians were subjected to a series of massacres and forced displacement campaigns across Ottoman and Persian territories, an event referred to by Assyrians as the Saipho, meaning sword in Aramaic. Entire villages were wiped out. The Assyrian Evangelical Church lost enormous portions of its congregation and its institutional infrastructure virtually overnight. What followed was a diaspora, surviving communities scattered into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and eventually much further, into Sweden, the United States, and Australia. The church rebuilt itself across multiple continents, holding services in Neo-Aramaic, which remains the spoken liturgical and community language to this day. That detail alone is worth pausing on. Neo-Aramaic is a direct descendant of the language used across the ancient Near East for centuries, the lingua franca of trade and diplomacy long before Arabic dominated the region. The Assyrian Evangelical Church is one of the living institutions where you can still hear it spoken in a congregational setting. Today, the church remains small in absolute numbers, but it carries an outsized historical weight. It represents the intersection of one of the world's oldest Christian traditions with a 19th century Protestant Reformation movement, filtered through one of the 20th century's least discussed ethnic tragedies. Most of its global membership exists entirely outside the Assyrian homeland, worshipping in communities that are themselves the product of survival against significant odds. The Armenian Evangelical Church is one of the more quietly fascinating stories of religious transformation to come out of the 19th century, because it didn't emerge from a prophet, a vision, or a schism over doctrine. It emerged from foreign missionaries with Bibles, printing presses, and a very specific agenda. In the 1820s, American Protestant missionaries from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions arrived in the Ottoman Empire. They weren't targeting pagans or the unchurched. They were targeting Armenian Apostolic Christians, one of the oldest Christian communities on Earth, whose church dates back to 301 AD. The idea was to reform them, stripping away what the missionaries saw as centuries of accumulated ritual and tradition that obscured the true gospel. The Armenian apostolic establishment did not take kindly to this. The apostolic patriarch eventually excommunicated Armenians who sided with the Protestant missionaries in 1846. That excommunication effectively forced the hand of those Armenians, and the Armenian Evangelical Church was formally organized in Constantinople that same year, with 40 founding members. What makes the early history particularly loaded is the political dimension. The Ottoman government officially recognized the Armenian evangelical community as a separate millet, which was the Ottoman term for a legally recognized non-Muslim religious community. This gave them a degree of legal autonomy, but it also separated them from the broader Armenian community at one of the most dangerous moments in Armenian history. During the Armenian Genocide of 1915, the community was devastated alongside every other Armenian denomination. The genocide scattered Armenian evangelicals across the globe, and this is a major reason why today the church exists primarily in the diaspora rather than in its historical homeland. Significant congregations took root in Lebanon, Syria, the United States, and South America. The theological profile of the church sits comfortably within mainline Protestant Christianity, emphasizing scripture, personal conversion, and congregational governance rather than the hierarchical episcopal structure of the Apostolic Church. Services are conducted in Armenian, which has served as a cultural anchor for diaspora communities trying to maintain language and identity across generations. There's an ongoing tension in the community that never fully resolved. Whether the Armenian Evangelical Church represents a genuine reformation of Armenian Christianity, or whether it represents a colonial intrusion that divided a people at a vulnerable moment in their history. That debate still surfaces in Armenian academic and theological circles, particularly among those in the diaspora who see denominational division as a weakness the community can't afford. Today, the church operates under the umbrella of the Armenian Evangelical Union, coordinating congregations across multiple continents, and maintains ecumenical relationships with both Protestant bodies and, somewhat remarkably, the Armenian Apostolic Church it once split from. Church of Euthanasia represents one of the most deliberately provocative religious movements to emerge from the 1990s counterculture scene. Founded by electronic musician and digital artist Chris Korda in Boston in 1992, this organization built its entire doctrine around what they called the four pillars: self-removal, abortion, cannibalism, and what they termed sodomy. The church's central premise revolves around radical population reduction as the ultimate solution to environmental destruction. Their infamous slogan, "Save the planet, kill yourself," appeared on bumper stickers, t-shirts, and throughout their early website, which featured a bright red background with dancing skeletons and upbeat techno music. Korda, who later transitioned and became known for both musical compositions and controversial activism, claimed the church's founding came through a divine vision from an alien intelligence called the Being. This entity allegedly revealed that humanity's only path to redemption involved voluntary extinction through the four pillars. The organization distributed self-removal kits containing plastic bags and instructions, leading to legal confrontations with authorities in multiple states. Their materials included step-by-step guides and even hosted online discussions about methods, drawing investigations from law enforcement agencies concerned about their influence on vulnerable individuals. Beyond the shock value, the Church of Euthanasia operated sophisticated propaganda campaigns. They created professional quality videos, maintained an extensive website with philosophical writings, and even produced a public access television show called Snuff It that aired in Boston during the mid-1990s. The cannibalism pillar received particular attention when the organization published Stewed Youth, a cookbook featuring recipes for human meat preparation. While presented as satirical commentary on meat consumption, the detailed instructions and accompanying artwork pushed boundaries of acceptable discourse even within underground circles. Their membership peaked at around 100 active participants, though thousands more engaged with their materials online. The movement gradually dissolved in the early 2000s as legal pressures mounted and Korda shifted focus toward transgender activism and academic pursuits in computer science and music theory. Matrixism emerged in the early 2000s as followers began treating the Matrix film trilogy as legitimate religious scripture rather than entertainment. These practitioners view the movies as allegorical texts revealing fundamental truths about the nature of reality and human consciousness. The central doctrine revolves around the concept that our perceived reality functions as a complex simulation or illusion, with most humans trapped in a state of unconscious acceptance. Matrixists interpret Neo's journey as a metaphor for spiritual awakening, with the red pill representing the choice to pursue uncomfortable truths over comfortable delusions. Several organized groups formed around these beliefs, including the Church of Matrixism and various online communities that developed their own interpretations of the trilogy's symbolism. Some practitioners incorporated elements from Gnostic Christianity, Buddhism, and Hindu concepts about Maya or illusion, creating hybrid belief systems that used the films as a modern framework for ancient spiritual concepts. The movement gained particular attention when some adherents began applying for religious recognition from government authorities. In 2005, members attempted to register Matrixism as an official religion in New Zealand, arguing that their beliefs deserved the same legal protections as traditional faiths. Matrixist practices often involve meditation techniques aimed at awakening consciousness, along with study groups that analyze the films frame by frame for hidden meanings. Some communities developed elaborate interpretations connecting the trilogy's themes to conspiracy theories about social control, media manipulation, and the nature of technological dependence. The philosophy extends beyond simple movie appreciation into genuine lifestyle changes, with some practitioners adopting minimalist approaches to material possessions and questioning mainstream narratives about politics, economics, and social structures. United Church of Bacon stands as one of the most successful satirical religious movements in modern America, founded by John Whiteside in Las Vegas around 2010. This organization uses Bacon worship as a vehicle to expose contradictions in how society treats religious institutions. The church ordains thousands of ministers worldwide who can legally perform weddings in most states. Their ordination process costs $9 and includes an official certificate declaring the recipient a Bacon minister. These ministers have successfully conducted hundreds of real, legally binding marriages across the United States, often incorporating Bacon-themed elements into traditional ceremonies. Whiteside designed the organization to challenge religious tax exemptions and special privileges. The church applied for federal tax-exempt status, forcing the IRS to evaluate whether Bacon worship qualifies as legitimate religious practice. Their application included detailed theological arguments about Bacon's role as a unifying force in human culture, citing its presence across multiple cuisines and its ability to bring people together. The church operates physical locations, including their original Las Vegas chapel, where couples can get married surrounded by Bacon-themed decorations and imagery. They offer wedding packages that include Bacon-flavored elements, though the ceremonies themselves follow standard legal requirements for marriage. Their activism extends beyond marriage services. Church representatives have challenged prayer policies at government meetings by requesting to offer Bacon-themed invocations. When city councils open sessions with Christian prayers, Bacon ministers request equal time to deliver speeches about the spiritual significance of pork products. The organization maintains detailed religious doctrine, including the 8 Awesome Teachings, which promote concepts like praise for bacon, skepticism toward dogma, and the importance of critical thinking. They've created hymns, ceremonial practices, and even Bacon-themed religious artwork that adorns their facilities. Legal challenges have tested the boundaries of their recognition. Several states initially rejected their ministers' authority to perform marriages, leading to court battles that the church has generally won by demonstrating their compliance with standard religious organization requirements. Ringing Cedars Anastasianism stems from a series of books by Russian businessman Vladimir Maigret, beginning with Anastasia in 1996. Maigret claimed these weren't fiction, but autobiographical accounts of his encounters with a mystical woman living alone in the Siberian wilderness. According to Maigret's narrative, Anastasia possessed telepathic abilities and could communicate directly with plants, animals, and the natural world. She allegedly demonstrated powers including healing through touch, predicting future events, and projecting her consciousness across vast distances. The woman supposedly lived without modern amenities, surviving Siberian winters through her connection to nature and ancient knowledge passed down through generations. The movement centers around Anastasia's supposed revelation that humanity's salvation lies in family homesteads of exactly 1 hectare, about 2.5 acres. Followers believe these plots, when cultivated with love and intention, become living ecosystems that provide everything a family needs while healing both the land and the inhabitants' souls. Cedar trees play a central role in the belief system. Anastasia claimed these trees emit beneficial energy frequencies, the ringing that gives the movement its name. Practitioners often sleep on cedar shavings, burn cedar incense, and construct homes using cedar wood to harness these supposed vibrations. The book sparked the creation of hundreds of eco-villages across Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet states. Residents attempt to recreate Anastasia's lifestyle, growing their own food, homeschooling children according to natural principles, and rejecting modern technology and medicine. Critics point to the movement's cult-like characteristics, including followers' devotion to Megre's increasingly elaborate claims about Anastasia's powers, and the rigid adherence to specific agricultural and lifestyle practices outlined in the books. Aliran Kepercayaan encompasses hundreds of indigenous belief systems across Indonesia that exist in a peculiar legal twilight zone. These spiritual movements fall outside the country's 6 officially recognized religions, yet millions of Indonesians practice them daily. The Indonesian government created this classification in 1965 as a way to acknowledge these beliefs without granting them full religious status. Practitioners cannot register their faith on identity cards and face constant pressure to convert to an approved religion. Many choose to list themselves as Muslim or Christian while secretly maintaining their traditional practices. These movements blend ancient animistic traditions with elements borrowed from Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism. Kejawen, practiced primarily in Java, combines Javanese mysticism with Islamic concepts. Followers believe in spiritual energy called tenaga dalam, and practice meditation techniques that supposedly grant supernatural abilities. Sunda Wiwitan adherents in West Java worship at sacred sites, and maintain that their faith predates Islam's arrival. They face regular harassment from Islamic groups who view them as primitive holdovers from the pre-Islamic era. The Dayak peoples of Borneo practice kaharingan, which involves elaborate funeral rites where the deceased journey to the afterlife via carved wooden boats. The Indonesian government pressured them to register as Hindu, creating the bizarre situation where animistic Dayak shamans officially count as Hindu priests. Some groups have adapted by incorporating Islamic terminology into their rituals while maintaining traditional practices. Others operate underground networks, passing down secret teachings through family lines. The government estimates over 12 million Indonesians belong to these unrecognized faiths, though the true number likely exceeds this significantly. Modern technology has created unexpected survival strategies. WhatsApp groups coordinate ceremonies across islands, while YouTube channels spread traditional chants to younger generations who might otherwise abandon their ancestral beliefs. 3HO stands for Healthy, Happy, Holy Organization, a spiritual movement that emerged in 1969 when Harbhajan Singh Khalsa, better known as Yogi Bhajan, arrived in Los Angeles from India. This group blends Kundalini Yoga with Sikh religious practices, creating what Bhajan claimed was an ancient spiritual system passed down through secret lineages. Bhajan attracted thousands of young Western followers during the counterculture movement, many of whom adopted Sikh names, wore white clothing and turbans, and followed strict dietary guidelines. The organization grew into a multi-million-dollar business empire, with ventures including yogi tea, security companies, and various health food enterprises. The movement's teachings center around Bhajan's version of Kundalini Yoga, which he said unlocked spiritual powers and higher consciousness. Members practiced specific breathing techniques, chanted mantras in Gurmukhi, and followed what Bhajan described as the Dharma of the Aquarian Age. He claimed to be the only living master of this particular yogic tradition in the West. However, former members and Sikh scholars have challenged many of Bhajan's claims about authenticity. Research suggests he created much of the spiritual system himself, rather than preserving ancient practices. The Sikh religious establishment in India largely rejected 3HO's interpretations and innovations to traditional Sikh practices. The organization faced serious allegations throughout its history, including claims of financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and inappropriate conduct by leadership. Former members described a rigid hierarchy where questioning Bajan's authority was forbidden, and leaving the group often meant abandoning family and financial security. Despite these controversies, 3HO continues to operate internationally, maintaining yoga centers, ashrams, and businesses, while promoting what they call the teachings of Yogi Bhajan. Bnei Menashe translates to Children of Manasseh, and refers to communities in northeast India who claim direct descent from one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. These groups, primarily located in the remote states of Manipur and Mizoram, have spent decades advocating for recognition as authentic descendants of the biblical tribe of Manasseh. The communities point to specific cultural practices they say prove their ancient Israelite origins. They cite traditional songs mentioning crossing a great body of water, dietary restrictions that mirror kashrut laws, and ritual practices involving animal sacrifice that they claim predate any Christian missionary contact. Some community members describe ancestral memories of temple worship and observance of what they identify as biblical holidays. Rabbi Eliyahu Avichail became the primary advocate for their cause in the 1980s after visiting the region and documenting their customs. He founded the organization Amishav specifically to research and support communities claiming lost tribe ancestry. Under his guidance, thousands of Bnei Menashe members underwent formal conversion to Orthodox Judaism. The Israeli government's response created significant controversy within Jewish religious circles. In 2005, then Sephardic chief Rabbi Shlomo Amar officially recognized the Bnei Menashe as descendants of the lost tribe, opening the door for their immigration to Israel under the law of return. Genetic studies have produced mixed results regarding their claims. Some researchers found genetic markers suggesting Middle Eastern ancestry among certain individuals, while others found predominantly East Asian genetic signatures consistent with their geographic location. Since 2006, over 4,000 Bnei Menashe have immigrated to Israel, with many settling in West Bank communities. This immigration pattern has drawn criticism from various quarters, with some arguing that their settlement in contested territories serves political rather than humanitarian purposes. The communities maintain detailed oral histories describing their ancestors' journey from ancient Israel through Central Asia before settling in northeast India. These accounts include specific geographical landmarks and cultural practices that community leaders say were preserved across millennia of displacement. The Church of the FirstBorn of God represents one of America's most dangerous faith-healing sects, where divine intervention takes precedence over medical intervention with deadly consequences. This fundamentalist Christian group operates through a network of over 100 congregations across 20 states, yet maintains no central headquarters or official membership records. The movement traces back to John Burton, a former Mormon missionary who was excommunicated from the Latter-day Saints Church in the 1800s for apostasy. When Burton petitioned for readmission in 1860, church leaders denied his request due to what they termed impure motives. This rejection became the catalyst for Burton's formation of what would eventually become the Church of the FirstBorn of God. Members embrace an extreme interpretation of James 5:14, which speaks of healing through prayer and anointing with oil. The doctrine prohibits conventional medical treatment, viewing it as a demonstration of weak faith or outright sin against God. Former members report that those who seek medical care face shunning from the community, treated as spiritual failures who have betrayed divine trust. The consequences prove fatal with disturbing regularity. Legal documents from 1996 court cases reveal a pattern of preventable deaths, particularly among children whose parents refuse medical intervention for treatable conditions. Defense attorneys representing church members have had to argue cases involving faith-healing deaths, highlighting the group's willingness to let family members perish rather than compromise their beliefs. Critics familiar with the organization have documented a particularly telling hypocrisy. Some members will call veterinarians for sick animals, while simultaneously refusing medical care for their own children and spouses. This selective application of healing philosophy exposes the contradictions within their theological framework. The church operates under various names including Burtonites, faith preachers, and true followers, but members historically called themselves the followers of Christ. Their decentralized structure makes tracking membership difficult, though estimates in the 1970s suggested around 6,000 adherents. Each congregation operates autonomously under local elders, creating a network of isolated communities bound by shared dangerous practices. Vseyasvetnaya Gramota translates to all-world script, a mystical writing system that emerged from Russian esoteric circles in the late 20th century. Proponents claim this alphabet represents an ancient Slavic script capable of unlocking cosmic secrets hidden within the Russian language itself. The system gained traction through the work of Gennady Grigorievich Dulya and other Russian mystics who insisted they had rediscovered humanity's original written language. According to their teachings, each symbol in Vseyasvetnaya Gramota contains multiple layers of meaning that connect directly to universal principles and natural laws. Believers use this script to decode what they consider hidden messages embedded in everyday Russian words. They claim standard Cyrillic writing deliberately obscures the true spiritual meaning that only becomes apparent when text is converted into their ancient alphabet. The practice involves elaborate interpretations where individual letters supposedly reveal connections between concepts that modern linguistics overlooks. For instance, practitioners might analyze a simple word and extract complex philosophical meanings by breaking it down into Vseyasvetnaya Gramota components. This system became particularly popular among Russian nationalist groups who embraced the idea that ancient Slavic civilization possessed advanced spiritual knowledge that was systematically suppressed. The script fits neatly into broader narratives about lost Aryan wisdom and the superiority of pre-Christian Slavic culture. Modern linguistic analysis reveals Vseyasvetnaya Gramota as a 20th century invention rather than an archaeological discovery. However, its followers dismiss such criticism as part of the same conspiracy that allegedly buried the original script. The movement continues to attract Russians seeking spiritual alternatives to both Orthodox Christianity and Western New Age practices, offering them what feels like an authentically Slavic path to enlightenment. Adidam emerged from the teachings of Franklin Jones, a spiritual teacher who later proclaimed himself as Adidam Samraj, claiming to be the literal divine incarnation for this age. Jones established this movement in the 1970s after studying under various gurus and developing what he called the radical understanding. The core teaching centers around Adidam's assertion that he represents the divine person appearing in human form. Followers, known as devotees, engage in intensive spiritual practices designed around complete surrender to their teacher. This includes long periods of meditation, strict dietary restrictions, and participation in elaborate ceremonial gatherings. What sets Adidam apart from typical new religious movements is its founders' explicit claims of divinity combined with highly unconventional methods. Adidam taught that traditional spiritual seeking actually reinforces the ego, and that only direct transmission from a realized being could produce genuine awakening. The movement operates primarily from retreat locations in California, Hawaii, and Fiji, where devotees can live in close proximity to their teacher. The Fijian sanctuary, known as Adidam Samrajashram, served as Adidam's primary residence until his death in 2008. Former members have described intense psychological pressure within the community, including financial demands that left families impoverished and social isolation from outside relationships. The organization required substantial monetary contributions, with some devotees reportedly giving their entire life savings. Adidam produced over 70 books outlining his spiritual philosophy, often written in dense, repetitive prose that devotees study extensively. The movement continues operating today under the leadership of his appointed successors, maintaining the same devotional structure despite their teacher's physical absence. The group's secluded nature and demanding lifestyle requirements have kept membership relatively small, though exact numbers remain undisclosed by the organization. Kimbanguism stands as one of Africa's most significant religious movements, yet most people outside the continent have never heard of it, despite counting over 12 million followers today. The movement began in 1921, when Simon Kimbangu, a Baptist catechist in the Belgian Congo, claimed to receive divine visions instructing him to heal the sick and spread a new Christian message. Within months, thousands of Congolese were traveling hundreds of kilometers to witness his alleged miraculous healings in the village of Nkamba. Belgian colonial authorities quickly realized the political threat this presented. Kimbangu preached that Africans were equal to Europeans in God's eyes, and prophesied the eventual end of colonial rule. After just 5 months of public ministry, he was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. King Albert of Belgium commuted this to life imprisonment, and Kimbangu spent the next 30 years in prison until his death in 1951. The colonial government banned the movement entirely, but this only strengthened its underground spread. Followers were deported, imprisoned, and forced to practice in secret. The church developed a complex network of hidden communities across Central Africa, passing down Kimbangu's teachings through oral tradition and clandestine gatherings. After Congolese independence in 1960, Kimbanguism emerged from the shadows and gained official recognition. The movement established its headquarters at Nkamba, now renamed New Jerusalem, where Simon Kimbangu's tomb has become a pilgrimage site drawing hundreds of thousands annually. The church combines Orthodox Christian doctrine with distinctive African theological interpretations. They recognize Jesus Christ as Savior, but also venerate Simon Kimbangu as a prophet sent specifically to Africa. The movement maintains strict behavioral codes, including prohibitions on alcohol, tobacco, and polygamy, setting it apart from both traditional Christianity and local cultural practices. Today, the Kimbanguist Church operates schools, hospitals, and even its own university in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Its current leader, Papa Simon Kimbangu Kiangani, claims direct descent from the founder and maintains spiritual authority over congregations spanning multiple African nations. Builders of the Adidam operates as one of the most secretive Western occult schools still functioning today, built around a foundation story that reads like something from an esoteric thriller novel. Paul Foster Case established this organization in 1922, following what he claimed was a life-changing phone call. The voice on the other end identified himself as Master R, allegedly the same spiritual guide who had been instructing Case telepathically for years. This mysterious figure, believed by many occultists to be the legendary Count of Saint-Germain, arranged to meet Case in person at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City. After 3 weeks of intensive training sessions, Case abandoned his successful career as a musical conductor and orchestra leader to dedicate his life to this new mission. The timing wasn't coincidental. Case had just been expelled from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn after a heated conflict with Moina Mathers, the order's leader. Her complaint focused on Case's unauthorized teachings about sexual symbolism and intimate practices, topics that had no official place in the Golden Dawn curriculum. Case's rapid advancement through the order's grades had already sparked jealousy, but his introduction of these controversial subjects became the breaking point. Case's occult journey began decades earlier with an equally mysterious encounter. In 1909, a Chicago physician calling himself Dr. Flood approached the young musician on the street, greeting him by name and claiming to carry a message from a master of wisdom. This stranger offered Case a choice between continuing his comfortable musical career or dedicating himself to serve humanity in the coming age. The organization Case built operates through a correspondence course system that members describe as the most comprehensive Western mystery training available. Students receive weekly lessons covering tarot, Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, and meditation techniques. The materials remain strictly confidential, with members taking oaths to prevent sharing. This secrecy has created ongoing problems as unauthorized copies appear online, leading the organization to issue stern warnings about corrupted or incomplete versions. Builders of the Adytum maintains that the Kabbalah represents the mystical root of both ancient Judaism and original Christianity. They teach that Jesus himself was trained in these mysteries, a claim that forms the basis for their name, the Builders, referring to constructing the inner temple that Christ demonstrated when he spoke of rebuilding the temple in 3 days without hands. The organization's influence extends beyond its membership roles. Scholars have speculated that Case co-authored the Kybalion, one of the most influential Hermetic texts of the 20th century, though recent evidence suggests William Walker Atkinson wrote it alone. Case's corrected version of the Rider-Waite Tarot deck remains popular among practitioners worldwide. Today, approximately 5,000 members study these teachings across multiple continents, guided by materials that Case claimed came directly from his communications with Master R. The organization strictly controls access to these lessons, maintaining that the spiritual current behind the teachings can only be transmitted through proper channels. Case's final years included receiving additional communications from Master R, channeled alongside his successor Ann Davies and his wife Harriet. These later teachings, published in 2013, contain advanced instruction that Case believed prepared humanity for the next phase of spiritual evolution. Zuni mythology encompasses a complex belief system centered around multiple worlds and dimensional transitions that goes far beyond typical Native American spiritual frameworks. The Zuni describe a cosmology involving 4 previous worlds before the current 5th world, with humanity emerging through a series of underground chambers called the 4 wombs of the earth. Central to their system are the Kachinas, supernatural beings that serve as intermediaries between humans and the divine forces. These entities inhabit specific locations during different seasons, with over 300 distinct Kachina spirits documented in Zuni tradition. Each possesses unique attributes, sacred masks, and ritual requirements that must be followed precisely. The mythology describes the Zuni people's emergence at a location called the Middle Place, which they identify as their current homeland in western New Mexico. However, their creation accounts detail extensive migrations through underground tunnel systems and emergence points that have intrigued researchers studying southwestern archaeological sites. Particularly notable are the Zuni prophecies regarding the return of their lost white brother, Pahana, who departed with promises to return when the world faced great upheaval. This figure carries a sacred stone tablet that will prove his identity upon his return. The prophecy includes specific signs and timeframes that some researchers have connected to broader patterns in indigenous American prophecies. The Zuni maintain detailed knowledge of what they call the emergence place, describing specific geographical features and underground chambers that must remain secret from outsiders. Tribal members undergo initiation ceremonies in locations they claim connect directly to these emergence points, involving multi-day rituals in underground chambers that outsiders are forbidden from entering. Their astronomical knowledge includes precise tracking of celestial movements tied to agricultural and ceremonial cycles, with some calculations extending thousands of years into the past and future. The Zuni calendar incorporates lunar, solar, and planetary cycles in ways that demonstrate sophisticated mathematical understanding predating European contact. Arya Samaj represents one of the most politically charged Hindu reform movements of the 19th century, founded by Swami Dayananda Saraswati in 1875, with goals that went far beyond simple religious practice. The movement gained notoriety through its aggressive reconversion ceremonies called Shuddhi, which aimed to bring Muslims and Christians back into the Hindu fold. These ceremonies became flashpoints for communal violence across northern India, particularly in Punjab, where Arya Samaj established its strongest presence. Dayananda Saraswati claimed that all scientific knowledge could be found within the Vedas, including concepts like electricity, aviation, and atomic theory. His interpretations often stretched Sanskrit texts to their breaking point, leading to fierce debates with traditional Hindu scholars who accused him of manufacturing meanings that never existed. The organization's educational wing established hundreds of schools and colleges, but these institutions became breeding grounds for Hindu nationalism. Many prominent independence fighters, including Lala Lajpat Rai and Swami Shraddhanand, emerged from Arya Samaj circles, blending religious reform with political resistance. Their most controversial practice involved declaring that only Vedic Hinduism represented true religion, while dismissing centuries of Hindu traditions as corruptions. This put them at odds with both Orthodox Hindus and other reform movements like the Brahmo Samaj. The movement's influence extended into unexpected areas, including the promotion of Hindi over Sanskrit for religious ceremonies and the establishment of cow protection societies that sometimes turned militant. Their publishing house, the Arya Samaj Press, distributed materials that British authorities frequently censored for seditious content. Modern Arya Samaj communities continue operating globally, maintaining their founders' rigid interpretations while navigating contemporary religious and political landscapes. Romani Mythology encompasses a complex spiritual system that has remained largely hidden from outsider examination for centuries. The Romani people developed their beliefs through a unique fusion of Hindu origins, Christian influence, and localized European traditions, creating something entirely distinct from mainstream religious practices. The cornerstone of Romani spiritual belief centers on the concept of marime, a form of spiritual contamination that goes far beyond simple cleanliness. Objects, people, and even thoughts can become spiritually polluted through contact with death, certain bodily functions, or violations of sacred boundaries. This pollution spreads through invisible channels and requires specific rituals to cleanse. Their relationship with the deceased differs dramatically from Christian traditions. The Romani believe the dead continue to actively influence the living world for exactly 1 year after death. During this period, the deceased can bring fortune or misfortune depending on how properly their death rites were performed. The pamana, elaborate funeral feasts, serve not just as memorials, but as negotiations with the dead to ensure their cooperation rather than interference. Romani divination practices include dukering, a form of fortune-telling that combines palmistry with dream interpretation and the reading of natural signs. Certain Romani women, known as drabarni, hold hereditary positions as healers and spiritual intermediaries. These women possess knowledge of herb lore, curse removal, and communication with spirits that outsiders rarely glimpse. The belief system includes Del, a supreme deity concept that absorbed Christian elements while maintaining distinctly Romani characteristics. Below Del exists a hierarchy of spirits including the mule, dangerous ghosts of the improperly buried and protective ancestral spirits who guide family decisions. Romani mythology also features the Beng, malevolent spiritual forces that can possess individuals or locations. These entities require specific countermeasures involving iron objects, salt circles, and spoken charms passed down through family lines. The knowledge of these protective measures remains closely guarded within Romani communities. Their creation myths speak of the Romani people receiving special gifts from God, including the ability to see the future and communicate with the spirit world, but also bearing a curse of eternal wandering as payment for these abilities. Shingon Buddhism emerged in 9th century Japan as one of the most secretive and ritualistic branches of Buddhist practice. Founded by the monk Kukai, also known as Kobo Daishi, this esoteric school centers around the concept of Mikyo, literally meaning secret teachings, that can only be transmitted directly from master to student. Unlike other Buddhist traditions that view enlightenment as a lengthy process spanning multiple lifetimes, Shingon practitioners believe they can achieve Buddhahood within their current physical body through specific esoteric techniques. These practices involve complex combinations of mantras, mudras, and mandala visualizations that must be performed with precise timing and intention. The tradition incorporates elements from Tantric Buddhism, including the controversial use of sexual imagery and symbolism in certain advanced practices. Practitioners work with detailed mandalas, cosmic diagrams that map the universe according to Shingon cosmology. The most important of these, the Diamond and Womb Realm mandalas, contain hundreds of Buddhist deities arranged in intricate patterns that practitioners must memorize and visualize during meditation. Mount Koya in Japan serves as the sect's spiritual headquarters, where monks still practice many of the same rituals established over 1,000 years ago. The mountain houses Kukai's mausoleum, where followers believe he remains in eternal meditation rather than having died, waiting to guide the future Buddha Maitreya. Shingon ritual involves the 3 mysteries, coordinated actions of body, speech, and mind through mudras, mantras, and meditation. Advanced practitioners learn to manipulate these elements simultaneously while visualizing themselves as specific Buddhist deities, a practice that some critics argue crosses into magical thinking rather than traditional Buddhist philosophy. The tradition's influence extends beyond religious practice into Japanese arts, literature, and even modern popular culture, with many of its symbols and concepts appearing in contemporary media without most people recognizing their Shingon origins. Nichiren Buddhism emerged in the 13th century Japan through a monk who took an unusually aggressive stance that would make even the most devout practitioners of other Buddhist schools uncomfortable. Unlike the peaceful meditation-focused Buddhism most people know, Nichiren openly declared war on every other Buddhist school in Japan, calling them heretical and predicting national catastrophe if the country didn't abandon these false teachings. The core practice revolves around repetitive chanting of a specific phrase, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which translates to devotion to the Lotus Sutra. Practitioners believe this single sutra contains all of Buddha's essential teachings, making other Buddhist texts essentially worthless. Nichiren himself spent years in exile after authorities grew tired of his relentless criticism of established religious institutions. What sets this tradition apart is its confrontational evangelism. While most Buddhist schools emphasize inner peace and non-attachment, Nichiren Buddhism actively encourages practitioners to challenge other belief systems and convert others through debate and argument. Nichiren wrote extensively about how practicing inferior forms of Buddhism would lead practitioners straight to hell. Modern derivatives like Soka Gakkai International have carried this militant approach into contemporary times, combining rapid-fire chanting sessions with aggressive recruitment techniques. The organization has faced scrutiny in multiple countries for its intense pressure on members and its political ambitions. In Japan, Soka Gakkai essentially runs its own political party and has been accused of operating more like a corporate empire than a religious movement. The practice itself involves chanting sessions that can last hours, often performed in front of elaborate altars called gohonzon. Members frequently report dramatic life changes, financial windfalls, and miraculous healings attributed to their chanting practice. Pure Land Buddhism represents one of the most controversial developments in Buddhist history, fundamentally challenging the religion's core emphasis on personal enlightenment through meditation and ethical conduct. This school promises immediate salvation through simple faith in Amitabha Buddha, creating what critics call a Buddhist version of evangelical Christianity. The practice centers on the Nembutsu, a repetitive chanting of Namo Amitabha Buddha that supposedly guarantees rebirth in the Pure Land paradise after death. What sets this apart from traditional Buddhism is the complete reliance on other power, rather than personal spiritual development. Practitioners believe that simply calling Amitabha's name with sincere faith, even once, ensures salvation regardless of their actions or moral standing. This radical departure sparked the self-power versus other power debate that divided Buddhist communities for centuries. Traditional monks argued that Pure Land teachings undermined the fundamental Buddhist principle of personal responsibility for karma and enlightenment. Pure Land advocates countered that their path offered hope to ordinary people who couldn't dedicate their lives to monastic practice. The most extreme Pure Land sects developed into highly centralized organizations with hereditary leadership structures. Japan's Jodo Shinshu sect, founded by Shinran, abolished monastic celibacy and created a lineage of married priest patriarchs who accumulated significant political and economic power. By the medieval period, these temple networks functioned more like feudal territories than religious institutions. Some Pure Land communities developed messianic expectations around their leaders, particularly during Japan's turbulent medieval period. The Iko-Iki uprisings saw Pure Land followers forming armed religious communes that challenged samurai authority, believing their faith made them spiritually invincible in battle. Modern Pure Land Buddhism continues to attract controversy through its prosperity gospel elements, where devotion to Amitabha is promised to bring worldly benefits alongside spiritual salvation. Bhagavatism centers on an intensely personal relationship with the divine that goes far beyond conventional worship. This Hindu devotional tradition focuses specifically on Vishnu and his earthly forms, particularly Krishna, through practices designed to cultivate overwhelming love and emotional surrender. The tradition gained significant momentum through Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, a 16th century Bengali mystic who claimed to be Krishna himself in disguise. Chaitanya would enter such intense spiritual states that witnesses described him as literally transforming, his skin changing color, his voice altering, and his entire personality shifting to match what followers believed was direct divine possession. Bhagavatism distinguishes itself through the concept of rasa, which translates to divine flavors or emotional relationships with the deity. Practitioners don't simply worship Krishna, they adopt specific emotional roles. Some approach him as a child would a parent, others as a friend, and some take on the role of romantic lover, particularly modeling themselves after the cowherd girls who were said to be infatuated with Krishna. The Bhagavata Purana, the tradition's central text, contains detailed accounts of Krishna's supernatural abilities and romantic escapades that push the boundaries of conventional religious literature. These stories include shape-shifting, time manipulation, and intimate relationships with multiple partners simultaneously through divine multiplication of his form. Modern expressions like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, commonly known as the Hare Krishna movement, emerged from these ancient practices. Members engage in marathon chanting sessions designed to induce altered states of consciousness, often continuing for hours while dancing and playing instruments, until participants report experiencing direct communication with Krishna. The tradition's emphasis on complete emotional surrender has produced documented cases of practitioners abandoning families, careers, and social obligations after what they describe as direct divine commands received during meditation or chanting sessions. Gaudiya Vaishnavism emerged in the 16th century Bengal through the mystical experiences of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who claimed to be the combined incarnation of both Krishna and his consort Radha. This wasn't merely a theological position. Chaitanya reportedly entered trance states so intense that witnesses described his body changing temperature and his skin taking on a golden hue. The tradition centers on a specific chanting practice called kirtan, where devotees repeat the Hare Krishna mantra in rhythmic patterns. Practitioners claim this produces measurable alterations in consciousness, including experiences of divine presence and complete ego dissolution. Modern neurological studies have actually documented changes in brain activity during extended chanting sessions, particularly in regions associated with self-awareness and emotional processing. When A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada brought these practices to America in 1965, he established the International Society for Krishna Consciousness with a radical proposition. Members would adopt complete lifestyle changes including strict vegetarianism, no gambling, no intoxicants, and celibacy outside marriage. Former participants describe a total restructuring of daily life around temple schedules, with members rising at 3:30 a.m. for morning prayers and spending up to 8 hours daily in devotional activities. The movement gained significant attention through high-profile conversions, including George Harrison of the Beatles, who funded the printing of Krishna texts and recorded devotional music. Harrison's My Sweet Lord actually contains the Hare Krishna mantra, introducing millions to the chanting practice without their knowledge. Within ISKCon communities, devotees follow a hierarchical system where spiritual advancement determines social position. Members surrender personal possessions and accept assigned duties, from temple maintenance to book distribution on street corners. Former adherents report this created intense social pressure and dependency on the organization for basic needs. The practice of Sankirtan, or public chanting and book distribution, became particularly controversial when members were instructed to use deceptive tactics to solicit donations, including misrepresenting their identity and the destination of funds. Court cases in multiple countries documented systematic deception in fundraising operations throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Gaudiya Vaishnavism maintains that Krishna consciousness represents the original spiritual condition of all souls, requiring only proper technique to access. This creates a system where personal transformation becomes the primary evidence for the teaching's validity, making it particularly resistant to external criticism. Swaminarayan Sampradaya emerged in early 19th century Gujarat when a young ascetic named Sahajanand Swami declared himself the supreme manifestation of God, establishing one of Hinduism's most organizationally complex and financially powerful modern movements. Sahajanand Swami, who took the name Swaminarayan, implemented an unusually strict code of conduct that went beyond typical Hindu practices. Male devotees were required to maintain complete celibacy, avoid alcohol and meat, and never touch women, including their own wives after initiation. Female devotees faced similarly rigid restrictions, forbidden from speaking to or even looking at men outside their immediate family. The movement's organizational structure fractured dramatically after Swaminarayan's death in 1830, creating competing institutions that claim exclusive legitimacy. The Bocha Sanwasi Akshar Purushottam Swaminarayan Sanstha, known as BAPS, became the most internationally visible branch, constructing elaborate stone temples across the globe using traditional Indian craftsmanship. BAPS attracted significant controversy in recent years when former devotees filed lawsuits alleging the organization used unpaid or underpaid labor from Indian workers to construct their New Jersey temple complex. The workers claimed they were brought to the United States under religious visas, but forced to work construction for as little as $1 per hour while living in cramped trailers. The movement's theological claims extend beyond typical guru veneration. BAPS teaches that their current leader, Mahant Swami Maharaj, serves as the perfect devotee through whom followers can reach Swaminarayan, who they believe remains the supreme God. This creates a dual deity system where devotees worship both Swaminarayan and the current guru simultaneously. Modern Swaminarayan organizations have accumulated substantial wealth through donations and business ventures, with BAPs alone estimated to possess assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Their temples feature intricate stone carvings created without machinery, following ancient architectural techniques that require specialized artisans trained for decades in traditional methods. Mazdakism emerged in 5th century Persia as one of history's most radical religious experiments, combining spiritual doctrine with revolutionary social engineering that would make modern communes look conservative by comparison. Founded by a Zoroastrian priest named Mazdak, this movement took the concept of equality to extremes that scandalized the ancient world. Mazdak preached that all property should be held in common, from land and livestock to precious metals and gems. But the doctrine didn't stop at material wealth. The most explosive tenet involved the communal sharing of women, essentially abolishing traditional marriage and family structures. Mazdak argued that just as no one should hoard gold or grain, no one should monopolize relationships or claim exclusive access to partners. This wasn't some abstract philosophical principle either. Followers actually implemented these practices across Persian territories. King Kavad I initially embraced Mazdakism around 490 CE, seeing it as a tool to weaken the powerful noble class that threatened his rule. The religion spread rapidly among the poor and disenfranchised, who suddenly found themselves with access to aristocratic estates, treasures, and yes, wives and daughters of the wealthy. The backlash was swift and brutal. Persian nobles, understandably upset about losing their property and families, rebelled against Kavad and temporarily removed him from power. When Kavad returned to the throne, he had learned his lesson about the dangers of social revolution and turned against his former Mazdakite allies. The end came around 524 CE, when Kavad's son, the future Khosrow I, orchestrated a massive purge. Mazdak himself was executed along with thousands of his followers, many buried alive or impaled as a warning to future revolutionaries. The movement's brief existence left such a mark on Persian culture that Mazdakite became synonymous with dangerous radicalism for centuries afterward. Brethren of the Free Spirit operated as a loosely connected network of Christian mystics across medieval Europe from the 13th through 15th centuries. These groups developed a theological position that fundamentally challenged the authority of the Catholic Church through their interpretation of spiritual perfection. The core doctrine centered on the belief that individuals could achieve complete union with God during their earthly lives. Once this divine state was reached, members claimed they transcended all conventional moral boundaries. They argued that perfect souls became incapable of sin, regardless of their actions, because their will had become identical to God's will. This theological framework led to accusations of antinomianism, the rejection of moral law as binding on the spiritually perfect. Church authorities documented claims that some adherents abandoned traditional marriage practices, engaged in communal living arrangements, and dismissed conventional religious rituals as unnecessary for those who had achieved divine status. The movement gained particular notoriety in the Low Countries, Germany, and parts of France. Marguerite Porete, a French mystic executed in 1310, authored The Mirror of Simple Souls, which became associated with free spirit theology despite scholarly debate over direct connections. The Catholic Church responded with systematic persecution, declaring the movement heretical through papal bulls and inquisitorial proceedings. The Council of Vienne in 1311 specifically condemned their teachings, particularly the claim that humans could achieve such perfection that they no longer needed divine grace or church sacraments. Records from church trials reveal that some groups allegedly practiced nudity as a symbol of returning to pre-fall innocence, rejected private property as inconsistent with spiritual perfection, and claimed direct revelation superseded biblical authority. The movement's influence extended beyond its active period, with historians identifying theological parallels in later groups, including certain Anabaptist sects and elements of the Radical Reformation. Zunbil Religion refers to the syncretic faith practiced by the Zunbil dynasty, one of the last major non-Islamic powers to resist Arab conquest in what is now Afghanistan and eastern Iran during the 7th through 9th centuries. The Zunbils ruled from their stronghold near modern-day Ghazni and built their entire religious and political identity around the worship of Zun, a powerful sun deity whose name literally meant gold in the local language. This wasn't your typical sun worship, though. The Zunbils had created a fascinating religious fusion that blended elements of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and ancient local traditions into something entirely unique. The centerpiece of their faith was a massive golden idol of Zun, described by contemporary Arab historians as being so ornate and valuable that it drew pilgrims from across Central Asia. The statue reportedly had ruby eyes and was adorned with precious stones, housed in a temple complex that served as both religious center and fortress. What made the Zunbil resistance particularly noteworthy was how they used their religious identity as a rallying point against Islamic expansion. For over 2 centuries, they successfully held off Arab armies, turning their mountain territories into a refuge for practitioners of older faiths fleeing Islamic conquest elsewhere. The dynasty's end came in 870 CE, when the Safarid ruler Yaqub ibn Layth finally conquered their capital. In a move that symbolized the complete religious transformation of the region, he had the golden idol of Zun melted down and sent the precious metal to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as tribute. The last Zunbil ruler, whose actual name has been lost to history, reportedly converted to Islam rather than face execution, marking the end of organized sun worship in the Hindu Kush region. The Way of the 5 Pecks of Rice stands as one of history's most unusual religious taxation systems, where spiritual salvation came with an agricultural price tag. Founded by Zhang Daoling in 2nd century China, this early Taoist movement required every follower to pay exactly 5 pecks of rice annually to their local religious officials. Zhang Daoling claimed direct communication with the deified Laozi, who allegedly granted him the title of Celestial Master, and commanded him to establish a new covenant with humanity. The rice tribute served multiple purposes beyond simple taxation. It funded the movement's extensive charitable works, including free lodging houses for travelers and elaborate public feasts, while also creating a concrete bond between believers and their faith. The movement carved out what amounted to a theocratic state across parts of modern-day Sichuan and Shanxi provinces. Zhang Daoling's son Zhang Heng and grandson Zhang Lu expanded this religious kingdom, governing through a network of Taoist priests who served as both spiritual guides and civil administrators. Citizens faced punishment for sins through mandatory public works projects, typically road construction or community service lasting several months. Their confession rituals took place in specialized chambers called quiet rooms, where believers wrote their transgressions on 3 separate paper slips. One copy went to heaven by being burned, another to earth through burial, and the third to water via submersion in rivers or lakes. This 3-way confession process supposedly ensured that no sin could hide from divine justice. The movement's medical practices blended herbal remedies with ritual healing ceremonies. Patients received treatments that combined traditional Chinese medicine with elaborate prayer sessions, often lasting several days. Zhang Lu claimed his healing powers stemmed directly from his inherited connection to the Celestial Master lineage. Political tensions eventually forced the movement underground when traditional Chinese authorities grew concerned about this independent religious state within their borders. The rice tribute system survived in modified forms throughout various Taoist sects, though none maintained the original movement's remarkable combination of spiritual authority and agricultural economics. Yahwism represents the original ancient Israelite religion that existed before Judaism as we know it today developed. This early form of worship centered around Yahweh, but not as the singular, all-powerful deity of later tradition. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kuntilat Ajrud and Khirbet el-Qam reveals inscriptions mentioning Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting the storm god Yahweh originally had a female consort. These 8th century discoveries fundamentally challenge the narrative of ancient Israel as consistently monotheistic. The transition from Yahwism to Judaism involved a deliberate campaign to eliminate competing deities from Israelite worship. King Josiah's reforms around 621 BCE specifically targeted Asherah poles and shrines dedicated to other gods, indicating that polytheistic practices were widespread and needed active suppression. Yahweh himself appears to have originated as one deity among many in the Canaanite pantheon. Early biblical texts like Deuteronomy 32:8-9 suggest Yahweh was assigned Israel as his portion, while other nations belonged to different gods. The original Hebrew refers to the sons of El, indicating Yahweh was subordinate to the chief Canaanite deity El. The archaeological record from ancient Israel shows continued worship of multiple deities well into the monarchic period. Hundreds of female figurines, likely representing Asherah or similar goddesses, have been found in Israelite domestic contexts. These artifacts suggest that popular religion differed significantly from the official theological position promoted by later biblical writers. The transformation from monolatry, worshipping one god while acknowledging others exist, to true monotheism took centuries and involved systematic reinterpretation of older texts and traditions. House of Israel encompasses various modern religious movements, claiming to represent the authentic descendants of biblical Israelites, often challenging mainstream historical and genetic understanding of Jewish ancestry. These groups typically assert that certain populations, frequently African Americans, Native Americans, or other marginalized communities, constitute the true biological heirs to ancient Israel, while contemporary Jewish people are dismissed as imposters or converts with no genuine claim to Israelite heritage. The doctrine gained particular traction through figures like William Saunders Crowdy, who established the Church of God and Saints of Christ in 1896, teaching that African Americans were the real chosen people. Later iterations expanded these claims through groups like the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, founded by Abba Bivens in the 1960s. Core teachings revolve around reinterpreting biblical passages about slavery and diaspora as references to the transatlantic slave trade rather than ancient Middle Eastern events. Adherents point to verses in Deuteronomy describing curses upon Israel, including being taken to foreign lands in ships, as prophetic descriptions of African enslavement in the Americas. The movement often incorporates elaborate genealogical charts connecting specific biblical tribes to modern ethnic groups. The tribe of Judah typically corresponds to African Americans, while other tribes are assigned to various Latino and Native American populations. These connections rely heavily on linguistic similarities between Hebrew words and terms from other cultures, along with selective readings of historical texts. Many House of Israel groups maintain strict dietary laws, observe biblical holidays, and use Hebrew names and terminology in their worship practices. Some factions have developed increasingly militant rhetoric, viewing their identity claims as justification for confrontational street preaching and aggressive evangelism tactics, targeting both Jewish communities and mainstream Christianity. The theological framework frequently includes beliefs about an approaching apocalyptic period where the true Israelites will be revealed and elevated to their rightful position as God's chosen people, while current world powers face divine judgment. Borborites were an early Christian Gnostic sect accused of incorporating bodily fluids into their sacred rituals, earning them condemnation from Orthodox Church authorities and a place among history's most scandalous religious movements. This second-century group allegedly practiced what Church Father Epiphanius of Salamis described in graphic detail within his work against heresies. According to these accounts, the Borborites consumed human reproductive fluids and menstrual blood as part of their communion ceremonies, believing these substances contained divine sparks that needed to be reclaimed. Their theological framework centered around the Gnostic concept that matter trapped spiritual essence, and that consuming these particular bodily secretions would liberate imprisoned divine particles. They reportedly interpreted certain passages from Christian scripture as encoded instructions for these practices, viewing traditional communion as merely symbolic, while their version achieved literal spiritual nourishment. Epiphanius claimed to have encountered former members who described elaborate ritual sequences involving specific prayers, ceremonial consumption, and group participation. The sect allegedly called these substances the perfect meal, and considered anyone refusing to participate as spiritually incomplete. Modern scholars debate whether the Borborites actually existed as described, or if they represent exaggerated accusations designed to discredit Gnostic movements generally. The detailed nature of Epiphanius' account suggests either direct knowledge or remarkably creative fabrication for propaganda purposes. Some researchers point to similar practices in other mystery religions of the period, suggesting the basic concept wasn't entirely unprecedented, though the specific Christian theological justification appears unique to this group. The Borborite controversy illustrates how early Christianity's boundaries were established, partly through defining what constituted unacceptable religious behavior, with these alleged practices serving as a clear example of heretical extremism that Orthodox believers could rally against. Discworld mythology encompasses ancient cosmological beliefs that describe our planet as a flat disk rather than a sphere, supported by massive creatures or pillars. These concepts appear across multiple unconnected cultures, suggesting either shared ancient knowledge or fundamental human intuitions about world structure. Hindu and Buddhist traditions describe the world as a flat circular continent called Jambudvipa, centered around Mount Meru and surrounded by concentric rings of oceans and continents. This disk rests on the backs of 4 elephants, which themselves stand on a cosmic turtle called Kurma. Tibetan Buddhist texts provide detailed measurements. The central continent spans 100,000 yojanas, roughly 1.3 million kilometers in diameter. Norse cosmology presents Midgard as a flat disk, encircled by an enormous serpent called Jormungandr. The world tree Yggdrasil connects this earthly plane to 8 other realms, with its roots extending deep beneath the disk. Ancient Scandinavian texts describe the disk as surrounded by an impassable ocean where the serpent's tail meets its mouth. Mesopotamian creation myths depict the earth as a flat disk floating on the primordial waters of Abzu. Babylonian world maps from the 6th century BCE show the known world as a circle surrounded by a bitter river called Oceanus. The Enuma Elish describes how Marduk fashioned the earth as a flat surface after defeating the chaos dragon Tiamat. Egyptian mythology portrays the world as a flat disk with the Nile running through its center. The goddess Nut arches over this disk as the sky, while the earth god Geb lies flat beneath. The sun god Ra travels across Nut's body in his solar bark, disappearing into the underworld each night to battle the serpent Apophis. Modern adherents of these ancient models argue that consistent disk imagery across isolated cultures indicates suppressed knowledge about our planet's true shape. They point to the fact that Terry Pratchett's popular fantasy series, while fictional, draws directly from these genuine mythological traditions that predate modern astronomy by millennia. Archaeological evidence shows that flat Earth disk models dominated human understanding for thousands of years before Greek philosophers proposed spherical alternatives. Stone carvings, temple layouts, and religious texts from diverse civilizations consistently depict disk-shaped cosmologies with supporting creatures or structures beneath. Illuminates of Thanateros stands as one of the most influential magical orders to emerge from the chaos magic movement of the late 20th century. Founded in 1978 by occultists Peter Carroll and Ray Sherwin, this organization took a radically different approach to magical practice than traditional ceremonial orders. The group's name combines illuminates, referencing enlightenment, with Thanateros, a fusion of the Greek gods Thanatos, representing death, and Eros, representing life and desire. This duality became central to their magical philosophy, embracing both creative and destructive forces as necessary components of effective sorcery. Carroll and Sherwin developed what they called the magical paradigm, which rejected the rigid hierarchies and elaborate rituals of groups like the Golden Dawn. Instead, members practiced paradigm shifting, deliberately adopting different belief systems temporarily to achieve magical results. A practitioner might invoke Hindu deities one day, work with quantum physics metaphors the next, then shift to comic book characters as magical entities. The order's structure operates through colored sections representing different magical approaches. The black section focuses on traditional sorcery and divination. The blue section explores healing and beneficial magic. The orange section deals with what they term illumination, expanded consciousness, and mystical experiences. Members advance through degrees marked by practical magical achievements, rather than academic study. Their most notorious practice involves achieving altered states of consciousness they call gnosis through various extreme methods. These techniques range from exhaustive physical exercise and sensory overload to deliberate confusion and contradiction of normal thought patterns. The goal involves bypassing rational mind filters to access what chaos magicians believe are deeper magical currents. The organization gained particular notoriety for their Liber Null manual, which Carroll authored as a practical guide to chaos magic techniques. This text introduced concepts like sigil magic to wider audiences, where practitioners encode their desires into abstract symbols, charge them with emotional energy, then deliberately forget their original intention to allow the unconscious mind to manifest the result. By the 1990s, Internal disputes led to fractures within the organization. Different factions emerged with varying interpretations of Carroll's original teachings, though local groups continue operating worldwide under the Illuminates of Thanateros banner. Nuwaubian Nation began as a black supremacist religious movement in the 1970s, but morphed into something far stranger under the leadership of Dwight York, a man who claimed dozens of different identities throughout his career. York presented himself as everything from an ancient Egyptian pharaoh to an extraterrestrial being from the planet Rizq. His followers knew him by names like Maliki Z, York, Isa al-Hadi al-Mahdi, and Dr. York. The movement's theology shifted constantly, incorporating elements from Islam, Christianity, ancient Egyptian religion, and UFO beliefs into an ever-changing doctrine that kept followers perpetually off balance. The group established a 476-acre compound called Tama-Re in Putnam County, Georgia, complete with pyramid structures and Egyptian-style buildings. York claimed this location sat on a sacred energy vortex and would serve as a landing pad for the mothership from his home planet. The compound featured a bookstore, recording studio, and living quarters for hundreds of followers who dressed in elaborate Egyptian-inspired costumes. York's prolific writing output included over 450 books and pamphlets, covering topics from black nationalism to alien abduction narratives. His literature claimed that black people were the original inhabitants of Earth, that white people were created through genetic experiments by an evil scientist named Yaqub, and that the government was run by shape-shifting reptilian beings. He taught that the year 2003 would bring about the end of the world, with only his followers surviving aboard UFOs. The movement generated millions of dollars through book sales, donations, and various business ventures. Followers surrendered their possessions and worked without pay at York's enterprises, while he lived lavishly, wearing expensive jewelry and driving luxury vehicles. Law enforcement began investigating the group in 2002 following reports of inappropriate conduct with minors. York was arrested and eventually convicted on federal charges related to the mistreatment of children within the community. He received a 135-year prison sentence in 2004, effectively ending the movement's organized activities. The Nuwaubian Nation demonstrates how charismatic leaders can exploit spiritual seeking and racial grievances to build powerful control systems, using constantly shifting beliefs to maintain psychological dominance over followers. Zurvanism emerged as a radical reinterpretation of Zoroastrian theology that placed time itself as the supreme deity. Rather than accepting Ahura Mazda as the ultimate creator, Zurvanite priests taught that a primordial entity called Zurvan, literally meaning infinite time, served as the source from which both good and evil emerged. The central myth describes Zurvan as an androgynous deity who doubted during a 1,000-year sacrifice intended to produce a son. This moment of doubt created Ahriman, the destructive force, while the intended offspring became Ahura Mazda, the creative force. Both beings emerged as twins from Zurvan's cosmic womb, making good and evil co-eternal rather than evil being a later corruption. This theological framework gained significant traction within the Sassanid Empire between the 4th and 6th centuries, particularly among court magi and intellectuals. The appeal stemmed from its elegant solution to the problem of evil's origin while maintaining cosmic dualism. High-ranking Zoroastrian priests like Cartier actively opposed these teachings, viewing them as dangerous corruptions of orthodox doctrine. Zurvanite cosmology operated on predetermined time cycles spanning 12,000 years, during which the cosmic battle between opposing forces would play out according to Zurvan's decree. This deterministic approach attracted followers who found comfort in the idea that even cosmic struggle followed a divine schedule. The movement's influence extended beyond Persia through trade routes and diplomatic contact. Several Manichaean texts show clear Zurvanite influence, and some scholars argue that early Islamic theological debates about divine predestination bear traces of Zurvanite concepts. Orthodox Zoroastrian authorities eventually succeeded in suppressing most Zurvanite communities, branding their teachings as heretical distortions. The systematic destruction of Zurvanite texts means most knowledge comes from hostile sources and fragmentary references, adding to the mystery surrounding their complete theological system. Adonitism describes a medieval Christian heretical movement centered on the radical belief that humans could return to the sinless state of Adam and Eve before the fall through ritual nudity and communal worship. These groups, scattered across Europe between the 13th and 15th centuries, took their theological interpretation to its most literal extreme. They stripped naked during religious ceremonies, claiming this restored their original innocence and allowed direct communion with God without the barriers imposed by clothing, which they viewed as symbols of shame introduced after humanity's expulsion from Eden. The Adamites, as they were commonly known, established several communities throughout Bohemia, particularly around Prague, where they gained notoriety under leaders like Picard of Beghards. Their gatherings involved not just ritual nudity, but complete rejection of marriage laws, property ownership, and traditional social hierarchies. They declared their communities to be the restored Garden of Eden, where conventional morality no longer applied. What distinguished Adamites from other heretical sects was their insistence that physical nakedness was essential for spiritual purity. They argued that Christ himself had been born naked, and therefore true Christians should worship in the same state. Some groups went further, claiming that those who achieved this spiritual state were incapable of sin regardless of their actions. The movement faced violent suppression from both Catholic and later Hussite authorities. The Bohemian Adamites were particularly targeted during the Hussite Wars, with their communities destroyed and members executed for heresy. Similar groups emerged sporadically in other regions, including the Netherlands and parts of Germany, though they remained relatively small and secretive. Despite their emphasis on returning to Eden's innocence, historical accounts describe their practices as creating significant social disruption, leading to their classification as dangerous heretics rather than legitimate reformers. Cutlerite describes a Mormon splinter group so obscure that most Latter-day Saint historians struggle to find documentation about them. While Brigham Young led thousands west and Joseph Smith III gathered the reorganized church, Alpheus Cutler took a handful of followers into the Iowa wilderness, convinced he alone carried Joseph Smith's true authority. Cutler wasn't just another succession claimant scrambling for power after Smith's 1844 death. He belonged to Smith's Council of 50, the secret governing body designed to establish God's political kingdom on earth. More crucially, Smith had personally ordained Cutler as a missionary to the Lamanites, the Native Americans that Mormon theology identified as descendants of ancient Israelites. This assignment became Cutler's obsession. In 1853, he declared both Brigham Young and Joseph Smith the third false prophets, and established his own settlement called Manti in Iowa. The Cutlerites operated under the belief that only Cutler possessed authority to organize Stakes of Zion, and his Native American mission would prepare the way for Christ's return. The group peaked at just a few hundred members practicing communal living in their Iowa settlement. They maintained what they considered the pure teachings from before Smith's death, rejecting later developments in Mormon doctrine. When Cutler died in 1864, the movement began its inevitable collapse. Without a succession plan or charismatic replacement, families slowly abandoned the settlement. The Church of Jesus Christ of Cutlerites officially dissolved in the 1920s when their last ordained priesthood holder passed away. Today, perhaps a dozen people can trace ancestry to Cutlerite families, though none practice the faith. The group left behind almost no records. Most historical information comes from hostile accounts written by rival Mormon factions or brief mentions in Iowa newspapers. A few journals survived through descendants who found the family history curious, even without sharing the beliefs. Kuramites represents one of history's most successful religious rebellions that managed to challenge an empire for over 2 decades through a blend of ancient fire worship and revolutionary communalism. This Persian movement emerged in the 8th century, mixing Zoroastrian fire rituals with Islamic theology and a healthy dose of social revolution. The Kuramites believed in the divine light of Zoroaster while accepting certain Islamic prophets, creating a theological hybrid that mainstream Muslims considered deeply heretical. Their leader, Babak Khorramdin, launched a rebellion in 816 that would rage across the Iranian highlands for 21 years. Babak claimed to be the reincarnation of various divine figures and established a mini-empire in the mountains of Azerbaijan, complete with fortified cities and a professional army. The movement practiced radical communalism that extended beyond property sharing. Historical sources suggest they maintained communal relationships and rejected traditional marriage structures, viewing exclusive partnerships as a form of spiritual bondage. These practices naturally horrified both Islamic and Christian chroniclers of the time. Babak's forces employed sophisticated guerrilla tactics, using the mountainous terrain to repeatedly defeat much larger Abbasid armies. They captured numerous cities and reportedly recruited followers through a combination of religious fervor and the promise of economic equality. The rebellion finally ended in 837 when Babak was captured through betrayal. The Abbasid Caliph had him executed in particularly gruesome fashion, but scattered Kuramite communities persisted for centuries afterward, maintaining their syncretic beliefs in secret. Their theological system influenced later Persian mystical movements, and some scholars argue their communal practices provided a template for various utopian religious communities throughout the medieval period. Hypsistotarians emerged in the ancient world as a mysterious religious movement that worshipped Theos Hypsistos, meaning the Most High God. These groups operated across the Roman Empire, particularly in regions like Asia Minor and the Black Sea area, creating a religious fusion that baffled contemporary observers and continues to puzzle scholars today. The movement combined Jewish monotheism with Greek religious practices and local pagan traditions. Members attended synagogues, but also participated in Greek festivals. They observed certain Jewish laws while simultaneously engaging in practices that Orthodox Judaism would reject entirely. This religious mixing created communities that existed in a theological gray area, belonging fully to neither tradition. Archaeological evidence reveals dedicated buildings called hypsisteria scattered throughout ancient territories. These structures featured altars inscribed with dedications to the Most High God, alongside symbols from multiple religious traditions. Inscriptions from Tanais, an ancient city near modern-day Russia, show adherents with both Greek and Semitic names participating in the same religious activities. The groups attracted what ancient sources described as God-fearers, Gentiles drawn to Jewish teachings but unwilling to fully convert. Hypsistotarians offered these individuals a middle path that allowed them to worship the Jewish God without circumcision or complete adherence to Jewish law. This accessibility made the movement particularly appealing in cosmopolitan Roman cities where different cultures intersected. Roman authorities found the movement difficult to categorize or control. Unlike established religions with clear hierarchies and defined practices, Hypsistotarian communities operated with fluid boundaries and localized variations. Some groups leaned more heavily toward Jewish practices, while others incorporated significant pagan elements, creating a religious landscape that shifted depending on geographic location and local influences. The movement's theological flexibility extended to their understanding of divine hierarchy. Rather than rejecting other gods entirely, many Hypsistotarian communities position Theos Hypsistos as the supreme deity ruling over lesser divine beings. This approach allowed them to maintain relationships with traditional Greek and local religious practices while asserting the primacy of their chosen god. Historical records suggest the movement faced opposition from multiple directions. Jewish communities viewed them as diluting pure monotheism, while traditional Greek religious authorities saw them as undermining established cult practices. Early Christian writers also criticized the groups for creating confusion about proper religious observance. Mohammedism refers to a secretive Islamic sect that emerged in late 15th century India, built around one man's audacious claim to be the prophesied savior of the end times. In 1495, a scholar named Syed Muhammad Jaunpuri stood before his followers and declared himself to be the Mahdi, the guided one who Islamic tradition says will appear before the day of judgment to cleanse the world of evil. His timing was deliberate and calculated. The Islamic year 1000 was approaching, a milestone that had many Muslims convinced apocalyptic events were imminent. Jaunpuri's followers, known as Mahdavis, adopted practices that immediately drew hostility from Orthodox Muslims. They rejected the traditional 5 daily prayers in favor of their own system and added a 6th kalima, or declaration of faith, specifically acknowledging Jaunpuri as the Mahdi. To mainstream Muslims, this bordered on heresy, since the kalimas are sacred formulations considered unchangeable. The movement survived through extreme secrecy and persecution. Mahdavi communities developed what they called concealment, hiding their true identity when necessary to avoid execution. During certain periods in Mughal India, discovery meant death. They maintained separate mosques and rarely discussed their beliefs with outsiders. The sect's survival depended on its tight community structure and elaborate hierarchy of spiritual authority. Mahdavis don't follow conventional religious scholars or imams. Instead, They follow a succession of spiritual guides called Khalifas, who trace their authority directly back to Jaunpuri himself. These Khalifas interpret the founder's teachings and maintain strict discipline within the community. Mahdavi mosques, called domes or deras, feature distinctive circular or octagonal designs rather than rectangular layouts typical of most mosques. Inside, worshippers sit in concentric circles during prayer sessions, symbolizing equality before God and shared devotion to the Mahdi's teachings. Modern Mahdavi communities exist primarily in Hyderabad, India, and Karachi, Pakistan, though exact population numbers remain difficult to verify given their culture of discretion. The sect continues facing discrimination and occasional violence from mainstream Muslims who view their beliefs as deviant. Their centuries-long practice of concealment has allowed them to persist as one of Islam's most secretive surviving sects. Brethren of Purity describes a secretive society of Islamic scholars and philosophers who operated in 10th and 11th century Baghdad and Basra. These anonymous intellectuals produced one of history's most comprehensive attempts to synthesize all human knowledge into a single work. The group created 52 treatises covering everything from mathematics and astronomy to music theory and dream interpretation. Their encyclopedia, known as the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity, blended Islamic theology with Greek philosophy, Pythagorean numerology, and Hermetic traditions in ways that mainstream Islamic scholars found deeply controversial. The society organized itself into 4 distinct levels of initiation, each corresponding to different ages and stages of spiritual development. Members progressed from craftsmen and merchants at the lowest level to rulers and prophets at the highest. They believed that true knowledge could only be achieved through this gradual ascent, combining rational study with mystical insight. What makes the Brethren particularly fascinating is how successfully they maintained their anonymity. Despite producing works that influenced centuries of Islamic thought, historians can only identify a handful of probable members. The group deliberately obscured their identities, referring to themselves only by symbolic names and maintaining strict secrecy about their meetings and rituals. Their influence extended far beyond the Islamic world. Medieval Christian scholars like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon drew heavily from their mathematical and scientific treatises. The group's approach to organizing esoteric knowledge into systematic hierarchies would later appear in various Western occult traditions, including certain Masonic and Rosicrucian texts. The Brethren taught that the material world was merely the lowest level of reality, with higher planes accessible only through proper preparation and initiation. They developed elaborate correspondences between numbers, celestial bodies, and spiritual states that promised practitioners a path to divine knowledge through methodical study. Yangism represents one of ancient China's most controversial philosophical movements, built around the teachings of Yang Zhu during the 4th century before Common Era. While Confucius preached social harmony and the Mohists advocated universal love, Yang Zhu took the complete opposite approach and declared that absolute selfishness was the highest virtue. Yang Zhu's central principle became legendary through a single phrase: he would not pluck out even one hair from his body to benefit the entire world. This wasn't just philosophical posturing. Yang Zhu genuinely believed that any sacrifice of personal interest, no matter how small, represented a fundamental violation of natural order. The philosophy gained significant traction among Chinese intellectuals, much to the horror of other philosophical schools. Mencius, the famous Confucian scholar, specifically called out Yang Zhu as one of the most dangerous thinkers of his era. According to Mencius, if everyone followed Yang Zhu's teachings, society would collapse into pure chaos as people abandoned all social responsibility. Yang Zhu's followers took his teachings to their logical extreme. They argued that traditional concepts like loyalty, filial piety, and social duty were artificial constructs that prevented humans from achieving their natural state of pure self-interest. Some adherents reportedly abandoned their families and social obligations entirely, focusing solely on personal pleasure and individual survival. The movement's influence spread far enough that it became one of the major philosophical targets for both Confucian and Mohist writers. They spent considerable effort refuting Yangist principles, suggesting the philosophy had gained substantial popular support despite its radical nature. Most of Yang Zhu's original writings disappeared over time, leaving behind only fragments and references in other philosophical texts. This selective preservation means that much of what we know about Yangism comes from its critics rather than direct sources, creating questions about whether the philosophy was as extreme as portrayed, or if opposing schools exaggerated its more controversial aspects. Kurdish Alevism blends Islamic mysticism with ancient Kurdish folk traditions in ways that Orthodox religious authorities have condemned for centuries. This syncretic faith combines Shia Islamic elements with pre-Islamic Kurdish beliefs, Zoroastrian influences, and shamanistic practices that date back thousands of years. The religion operates through a secretive oral tradition passed down by spiritual leaders called deities, who trace their lineage back to specific holy families. These deities memorize vast collections of sacred poetry, prayers, and ritual instructions that have never been written down, creating a living library of forbidden knowledge that exists only in human memory. Kurdish Alevis practice a form of worship called Sem, where men and women gather together in circles and perform ritualistic dances while spiritual music plays. This gender integration directly contradicts Islamic orthodoxy and has sparked centuries of persecution from both Sunni and Shia authorities who view these practices as heretical. The faith incorporates elements of nature worship, with sacred groves, springs, and mountaintops serving as pilgrimage sites. Kurdish Alevis believe in reincarnation and practice a form of spiritual confession where community members publicly admit their wrongs during religious gatherings. Many Kurdish Alevi communities have survived in remote mountain regions of eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and parts of Syria, maintaining their traditions in secret while outwardly conforming to mainstream Islam when necessary. The Turkish government has historically denied the existence of Kurdish Alevis as a distinct group, classifying them simply as heterodox Muslims rather than acknowledging their unique ethnic and religious identity. Their sacred texts include the Buyruk, a collection of teachings that differs significantly from standard Islamic literature, containing mystical poetry and ritual instructions that some scholars argue preserve elements of ancient Mesopotamian religions. Armstrongism emerged from the teachings of Herbert W. Armstrong, who claimed to be God's only true apostle in the modern era, and built a religious empire that demanded absolute submission from followers while rejecting virtually every mainstream Christian doctrine. Armstrong's central teaching involved Anglo-Israelism, the belief that white Americans and British people descended directly from the lost tribes of ancient Israel. This wasn't just spiritual symbolism, but literal genealogy according to Armstrong, making his predominantly white followers the true chosen people destined to rule over other nations during Christ's 1,000-year reign. The financial demands placed on members went far beyond typical church donations. Armstrong instituted a complex tithing system requiring followers to give not just 10% of their income, but multiple tithes throughout the year. First tithe went to the church, second tithe funded members' attendance at required festivals, and third tithe supported widows and orphans every third year. Combined with special offerings and emergency appeals, many families handed over 30 to 40% of their annual income. Members followed strict Old Testament dietary laws, observed Saturday as the Sabbath, and celebrated Jewish festivals instead of Christmas or Easter, which Armstrong declared were pagan holidays. Dancing, makeup, and medical care were forbidden, leading to preventable deaths when parents refused treatment for sick children. Armstrong proclaimed himself the end-times Elijah, predicting Christ would return in 1975, then later pushing the date to the 1980s. When these prophecies failed, he claimed the timeline had been misunderstood rather than admitting error. The worldwide Church of God operated like a totalitarian state, with Armstrong's word considered direct revelation from God. Members who questioned doctrine faced disfellowshipping, cutting them off from family and friends within the organization. Armstrong lived lavishly on member donations while preaching against materialism, owning multiple homes and traveling in private jets. After Armstrong's death in 1986, his successor, Joseph Tkach Jr., gradually dismantled the organization's core teachings, eventually aligning with mainstream evangelical Christianity. This transformation shattered the movement, spawning dozens of splinter groups led by former ministers who claimed to preserve Armstrong's original message. Hanafi represents the most widespread school of Islamic jurisprudence on the planet, yet its founder never actually wrote down his own legal opinions. Abu Hanifa, the 8th century scholar behind this system, relied entirely on oral instruction and debate with his students, who later compiled his teachings into what became the dominant legal framework for over half the world's Muslims. The school operates on a principle called istihsan, or juristic preference, which essentially allows judges to bypass strict analogical reasoning when it would lead to harsh or impractical outcomes. This flexibility made Hanafi law particularly appealing to diverse populations across the Ottoman Empire, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Abu Hanifa himself spent 2 years in prison rather than accept a government position as chief judge, believing that state involvement corrupted religious law. His refusal to collaborate with the Abbasid authorities led to his death in custody, making him something of a martyr for judicial independence. The Hanafi approach produces some notably different rulings compared to other Islamic schools. They permit the consumption of horse meat, allow women to marry without a guardian's permission, and consider small amounts of alcohol permissible if used for medical purposes. These positions often put Hanafi scholars at odds with more conservative interpretations. Modern Hanafi institutions wield enormous influence through organizations like Turkey's Diyanet, which employs over 120,000 religious officials and controls mosque construction across dozens of countries. This bureaucratic reach extends the school's interpretations far beyond traditional geographic boundaries, shaping Islamic practice for millions who may never realize they're following specifically Hanafi rulings. Underground church refers to Christian congregations that operate in secret to avoid government persecution, imprisonment, or execution, in countries where practicing Christianity can result in decades of hard labor, or worse, millions of believers meet in basements, abandoned buildings, and private homes with covered windows and posted lookouts. China's underground Catholic Church, loyal to the Vatican rather than the state-approved Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, operates an entire shadow hierarchy complete with bishops ordained in secret ceremonies. These bishops face constant surveillance, with some spending years under house arrest or in re-education camps. The government deploys facial recognition technology and informants to identify attendees, leading congregations to change meeting locations weekly and communicate through coded messages. North Korea takes enforcement further. Owning a Bible carries a minimum sentence of 15 years in a political prison camp, and 3 generations of the offender's family can face punishment under the country's collective responsibility system. Despite this, estimates suggest tens of thousands of Christians practice in absolute secrecy, memorizing scripture since physical copies would guarantee discovery during random home inspections. Iran's underground church grew significantly after the 1979 revolution made converting from Islam to Christianity punishable by death. Converts, called apostates under Sharia law, meet in constantly rotating house churches, using encrypted messaging apps and never discussing their faith outside trusted circles. Former Muslims who lead these gatherings face the highest risk, with some disappearing into Evin prison for insulting Islamic sanctities. The phenomenon isn't new. Early Christians met in Roman catacombs during empire-wide persecutions, and Soviet believers continued gathering throughout 70 years of state atheism, developing elaborate systems of coded hymns and smuggled religious texts printed on cigarette paper. Christian identity represents one of the most disturbing theological mutations to emerge from fringe American Christianity. This movement takes traditional Christian doctrine and twists it into a racial supremacist ideology that bears little resemblance to mainstream faith. The core claim sounds almost absurd until you realize how many people have embraced it. Christian identity adherents believe that white Europeans, particularly those of Anglo-Saxon descent, are the actual chosen people of the Bible. According to their interpretation, modern white Americans and Europeans are the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. This belief system emerged from an earlier movement called British Israelism, which gained traction in 19th century England. British Israelism made the less extreme claim that the British were descendants of the 10 lost tribes, but Christian identity took this concept and weaponized it with racial hatred. The movement's most toxic doctrine involves what they call the two-seed theory. This teaching claims that Eve had relations with both Adam and Satan, producing 2 distinct bloodlines. According to this twisted narrative, Abel represents the pure Adamic white race, while Cain represents the satanic bloodline that supposedly produced the Jewish people. Wesley Swift became the primary architect of modern Christian identity during the 1940s and 1950s. Operating out of California, Swift developed the theological framework that would influence decades of extremist groups. His student Richard Butler later founded the Aryan Nations compound in Idaho, creating a physical headquarters for the movement. The practical implications of these beliefs became tragically evident through various incidents. The Order, a terrorist group active in the 1980s, drew heavily from Christian identity theology while conducting armed robberies and targeted eliminations. Randy Weaver, whose family was involved in the Ruby Ridge standoff, had connections to Christian identity circles. Christian identity congregations typically operate as small, isolated communities led by self-appointed pastors who lack formal theological training. These groups often blend religious services with militia training and survivalist preparation. The movement appeals particularly to rural white Americans who feel economically displaced or culturally marginalized. The theology includes bizarre interpretations of biblical genealogies, claiming that various Old Testament figures were actually white Europeans. They argue that modern Palestinians and Middle Easterners are impostors who have stolen the Holy Land from its rightful white owners. Modern Christian identity has adapted to internet culture while maintaining its core racist messaging. Online forums and podcasts continue spreading these ideas, often disguised as biblical scholarship or historical research. Latter Rain emerged from a small Bible school in North Battleford, Saskatchewan in 1948, promising to restore the exact spiritual powers described in the New Testament. The movement claimed that God was pouring out a final wave of miraculous gifts before the end times, but their methods sparked immediate controversy across Christian denominations. The Sharon Orphanage and schools became ground zero for practices that seemed to blur the line between spiritual experience and human manipulation. Leaders like George Houghton and Herrick Holt developed a technique called laying on of hands, where they would physically touch students and visitors, claiming to transfer specific spiritual gifts directly from person to person. Witnesses described people suddenly speaking in unknown languages, prophesying detailed future events, and experiencing what appeared to be supernatural healing. The movement's approach to church authority proved even more divisive. Traditional Pentecostal churches operated with standard pastoral structures, but Latter Rain adherents insisted that God was restoring the original New Testament offices of apostles and prophets. These modern apostles claimed direct divine revelation that superseded written scripture and traditional church governance. William Branham, though not officially part of the movement, became closely associated with Latter Rain circles. His healing campaigns drew massive crowds who witnessed apparent miraculous healings and detailed prophetic revelations about strangers' personal lives. Branham's followers documented instances where he would call out specific names, addresses, and medical conditions of people he had never met. The movement's emphasis on body ministry challenged established religious hierarchies by encouraging all believers to actively participate in spiritual gifts rather than leaving ministry to ordained clergy. This created chaotic services where multiple people would simultaneously prophesy, speak in tongues, and attempt healings. By the early 1950s, major Pentecostal organizations, including the Assemblies of God, had officially condemned Latter Rain teachings. Critics pointed to authoritarian leadership structures, financial exploitation, and psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual discipline. Several prominent leaders faced accusations of using their claimed apostolic authority to control followers' personal decisions, including marriages and career choices. Despite institutional rejection, Latter Rain concepts spread through independent churches and eventually influenced later movements like the New Apostolic Reformation and various prosperity gospel teachings that continue operating today. The Source family operated as both a spiritual commune and the force behind one of Hollywood's most influential health food restaurants during the 1970s counterculture explosion. Jim Bakker, a former Marine and stuntman who transformed into the white-robed leader known as Father Yod, built an empire that fed celebrities while preaching a blend of mysticism, dietary extremism, and polygamous relationships. The group's restaurant on the Sunset Strip became the go-to spot for health-conscious celebrities like John Lennon, Marlon Brando, and Steve McQueen. What these famous patrons didn't realize was that their vegetarian meals were prepared by devoted followers who viewed cooking as a sacred ritual under Father Yod's guidance. Bakker claimed he could channel ancient wisdom and perform miraculous healings through his hands. His followers, who numbered over 140 at the commune's peak, believed he was the reincarnation of King David and called him their earthly father. The group practiced a form of spiritual polygamy, where Baker maintained relationships with multiple women who bore him children, all while the male followers remained celibate. The Source family produced over 65 albums of psychedelic rock music under the band name Yahweh 13, with Father Yod providing vocals despite having no musical training. These recordings, made in their Hollywood Hills compound, captured the group's drug-influenced spiritual sessions, and remain cult classics among collectors of obscure psychedelic music. Baker's death came during the group's relocation to Hawaii in 1977. Despite having no hang-gliding experience, he attempted to fly off a cliff and crashed, dying from his injuries. The commune dissolved shortly after, leaving behind a legacy that influenced both the health food movement and documented one of California's most unusual spiritual experiments. The group's story gained renewed attention through documentaries and books that revealed the darker aspects of their communal life, including allegations of manipulation and the psychological control Baker exercised over his followers through isolation and dependency. True Catholic Church encompasses several breakaway movements that claim the official Roman Catholic Church abandoned authentic Catholicism after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. These groups operate under the belief that recent popes are illegitimate heretics, leaving the papal throne technically vacant. The most prominent version emerged from Maurice Archieri, a former Franciscan priest who established his own True Catholic Church in 1967 after rejecting Vatican II reforms. Archieri declared himself the rightful successor to traditional Catholicism and began ordaining his own priests and bishops without Vatican approval. His movement gained traction among Catholics who felt betrayed by modernization efforts like conducting Mass in local languages instead of Latin, allowing laypeople to distribute communion, and reducing emphasis on traditional devotions. Archieri's group practiced extreme traditionalism, requiring women to cover their heads during services, maintaining strict fasting rules, and rejecting any cooperation with mainstream Catholic institutions. They established their own seminaries and convents, creating a parallel Catholic structure completely separate from Rome. The movement fractured after Archieri's death in the 1990s, spawning dozens of micro-churches across North America. Each faction claims exclusive legitimacy as the real Catholic Church, while denouncing all others as corrupted. Some groups number in the hundreds, others consist of single families operating from basement chapels. These communities face constant internal power struggles over apostolic succession, the unbroken chain of ordination dating back to the apostles. Without Vatican recognition, their clergy cannot prove legitimate ordination, leading to endless disputes about whose sacraments actually count in God's eyes. Fijian mythology encompasses a complex spiritual system where the line between the living and dead remains deliberately blurred through daily practice. Traditional Fijian beliefs center around the Bos Levu, powerful ancestral spirits who actively intervene in modern affairs through a network of appointed mediums called Bait. The most distinctive aspect involves the practice of Solevu, ritualistic feasting that historically included consuming defeated enemies to absorb their spiritual power or mana. These ceremonies weren't random acts of aggression, but carefully orchestrated spiritual transfers, where specific body parts carried different supernatural properties. The heart contained courage, the brain held wisdom, and consuming these elements literally transferred the victim's abilities to the consumer. Dege, the great serpent deity, plays a central role as both creator and judge of the dead. Unlike typical underworld concepts, Fijian afterlife geography includes Bulu, a mountainous spirit realm accessible through specific cave systems in the Nakauvadra mountain range. Living shamans regularly travel to Bulu during trance states to negotiate with deceased chiefs for guidance on tribal matters. Modern Fiji presents a unique religious landscape where Methodist Christianity coexists with traditional spirit work. Many Fijian families maintain dual practice, attending church on Sundays while consulting traditional healers called Daunivuku for serious illnesses. These practitioners diagnose spiritual causes behind physical symptoms, often attributing sickness to angry ancestors, or violated taboos called tabu. The Draunikau ceremony demonstrates this spiritual complexity, where entire villages participate in elaborate rituals to appease specific spirits responsible for natural disasters. Hurricane seasons trigger community-wide offerings to Dakuaka, the shark god who controls oceanic weather patterns. Participants present elaborate Yakona root preparations, while reciting genealogies connecting their families to marine spirits. Archaeological evidence from Viti Levu reveals specialized burial practices where chiefs were interred with their wives and servants, creating spiritual households in the afterlife. These companion burials weren't forced situations, but voluntary transitions based on beliefs that death merely relocated the social structure to another dimension. Samoan mythology encompasses a complex spiritual system where creation begins not with light or void, but with a cosmic rock called Tagaloa. According to these ancient beliefs, Tagaloa transformed from stone into the supreme creator deity, then proceeded to birth the universe through a series of increasingly bizarre methods. The creation process involves Tagaloa splitting himself into multiple aspects, each controlling different domains of existence. Tagaloa of the heavens governs the sky realm, while Tagaloa of the ocean controls all waters. This multifaceted deity system creates a universe where the same god can simultaneously argue with himself across different planes of existence. One of the most distinctive elements involves the role of the sacred worm Laulau Tasi. This creature doesn't simply exist in the mythology. It actively participates in island formation by burrowing through the ocean floor and creating the volcanic foundations of Samoa itself. The worm's movements directly correlate with real geological events, making this mythology unusually grounded in observable phenomena. The Adytum spirits function as intermediary beings between humans and the Tagaloa aspects. These entities possess the ability to inhabit both living people and inanimate objects, creating a world where any tree, rock, or household item might contain conscious supernatural intelligence. Traditional Samoan families maintain specific rituals to appease their ancestral Adytum, who can grant protection or unleash devastating curses depending on their treatment. The practice of tatau, traditional Samoan tattooing, connects directly to these mythological beliefs. Each tattoo design serves as both artistic expression and spiritual armor, with specific patterns invoking protection from particular Adytum or channeling power from different Tagaloa aspects. The tattooing process itself involves ritualistic elements that transform the recipient's spiritual status within the community. Traditional accounts describe the goddess Nafanua, who wielded a club capable of splitting islands and commanded armies of warrior spirits. Her battles against rival deities reshaped the physical geography of the Samoan island chain, with specific landmarks serving as evidence of her supernatural conflicts. The mythology includes detailed prophecies about the arrival of foreign influences and the gradual weakening of traditional spiritual practices. These predictions, recorded in oral traditions predating European contact, accurately described many aspects of colonial encounters and cultural transformation that wouldn't occur for centuries after their creation. Tahitian mythology encompasses a complex system of beliefs from French Polynesia that ventures far beyond the tourist-friendly tiki imagery most people recognize. The spiritual framework centers around powerful deities who demanded brutal offerings and operated through elaborate systems of taboo and sorcery. The most significant figure, Oro, served as the god of war and fertility, requiring human sacrifices during major ceremonies. Priests would select victims through divination rituals, often choosing children or prisoners of war. These offerings took place at marae, stone temple complexes where the boundaries between the physical and spirit worlds dissolved. Tahitian spiritual practice relied heavily on mana, a supernatural force that could be accumulated, stolen, or weaponized through specific rituals. Kahuna, the priestly class, wielded this energy to curse enemies, heal the sick, or communicate with ancestral spirits. They maintained strict oral traditions that kept the most potent incantations secret from common people. The concept of varua, or soul projection, allowed skilled practitioners to send their spirits out of their bodies to spy on distant locations or attack enemies in their sleep. This astral travel required extensive preparation and carried significant risks, as the soul could become lost or captured by malevolent entities during the journey. Tahitian creation myths describe multiple cosmic destructions where the gods periodically wiped out humanity through floods, earthquakes, and divine wrath. These cyclical apocalypses served as warnings about maintaining proper relationships with the spirit world, emphasizing that divine favor could be withdrawn at any moment. The mythology includes detailed descriptions of Po, the underworld realm where souls face judgment based on their adherence to taboo, the sacred laws that governed every aspect of daily life. Breaking these prohibitions could result in spiritual contamination that affected entire communities, making enforcement a matter of collective survival. Tuvalu mythology encompasses the traditional spiritual beliefs of one of the world's smallest nations, a chain of 9 coral atolls scattered across the central Pacific Ocean. These creation stories and supernatural frameworks developed in complete isolation from outside religious influence for centuries. The mythology centers around Tagaloa, a supreme creator deity who shaped the islands from primordial waters. According to traditional accounts, Tagaloa sent his daughter down from the heavens, and where her footprints touched the ocean floor, land rose up to form the atolls. This origin story carries particular weight given Tuvalu's precarious position barely above sea level. Tuvalu's spiritual landscape includes numerous Aitu, ancestral spirits that inhabit specific locations across the islands. These entities control everything from fishing success to weather patterns. The Aitu of Funafuti Atoll, for example, demand specific ritual offerings before major voyages or construction projects. Traditional practitioners maintain that certain lagoons serve as gateways between the physical and spirit worlds. The blue holes found in several atolls function as sacred sites, where communication with deceased ancestors occurs during specific lunar cycles. The mythology includes detailed genealogies connecting every family line back to original divine ancestors, creating a comprehensive spiritual hierarchy that governed traditional Tuvaluan society. These genealogies determine fishing rights, land ownership, and ceremonial responsibilities that persist even today. Modern Tuvalu faces complete submersion due to rising sea levels within decades, making this mythology particularly poignant. Traditional beliefs hold that the islands will transform rather than disappear, with the Aitu relocating the spiritual essence of Tuvalu to new realms beneath the waves.